The George Floyd murder trial gets underway in America as a row breaks out in the UK about the idea that Britain might not be institutionally racist. The WHO produces a report saying COVID probably didn't leak from a lab, but nobody believes it, and the EU says that it will definitely snatch vaccines from a lab in which the UK invested £20 million and the EU invested zero. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. America began the extended process of holding its breath this week as the murder trial of Derek Chovin, the police officer accused of killing George Floyd, got underway in earnest. And you can see how this is being set up to be an incredibly bad moment for America. Because this is a criminal trial, it's intended to look at the facts surrounding a case and determine whether, in the light of those facts, an individual should be convicted of committing crimes that are very specifically defined in law. Unfortunately, that's not how it's being seen at all. Instead, it's being taken as a referendum on whether America is racist. This quote given to the BBC is typical of numerous similar ones echoed by campaigners and politicians and indeed broadcasters. In this case, it's Curtis Hayes, described as a community activist and a candidate for City Council in Charlotte. This is a chance for America to show exactly what they represent, giving everybody liberty and justice for all. If you don't convict him of all three charges, you're simply telling Black America and minority Americans that we do not care for you. This is a white America and you're going to get down or lay down. Now people are fighting for equality, but soon they'll be fighting for revenge. And that is wrong on so many levels. Justice for all should include due process if you're accused of something, and being found guilty or innocent based on the evidence. But for many people, not only must Chovin be found guilty, he must be found guilty of all three charges, otherwise it's a sign that America is racist. And that's anti-justice, a political predetermination of what the outcome of a trial should be, regardless of the evidence. And you get a sense of how badly this may go because the defence has a passable case. And certainly it seems likely that while Chovin may well be found guilty of manslaughter, he may well not be found guilty of homicide, if you look at the exact definition of what has to be in place for those charges to stick. The case of the defence focuses on the fact that Floyd had overdose levels of fentanyl in his system and that similar incidents only months before had already put him in hospital. It'll point out that Chovin was using a technique that the police department had trained him to use, and that specific technique was used because it was supposed to be safer than certain alternatives. So the idea that you can prove Chovin evidenced depraved mind without regard to human life as required by third-degree murder is open to question. Likewise, the idea you can prove that Chovin was committing a felony in the course of which Floyd died as required by the second-degree murder, that is also open to question. I'm not saying that it's beyond possibility he can be convicted of these charges, and we've yet to see the main part of the prosecution argument, but it's entirely possible that a non-racist jury, looking at the requirements for the charges, looking at the facts, might come to a conclusion that the standard of proof, the reasonable doubt, has not been met. And then all hell will break loose, because they think they're judging the trial of a man who is owed a fair trial. But so many others think they're there to rubber stamp a political statement. We're throwing a die right now. If it comes down with a 6, all's going to be good. 1 to 5 is going to result in mayhem and rioting. Do you like those odds? By the way, there is no evidence at all that what Chovin did with George Floyd was based on racist intent. All of a narrative about what the case means, various people just assume that if there's a white police officer and a black victim, there must have been racism involved. Well, maybe there was, but there's been no proof of that to date. Since it's not required for the charges, I'm guessing we're not going to be seeing evidence of it in the trial either. Now, no politicians and no journalists are going to point that out, because the kickback would be strong and the benefit to them of pointing it out would be of little interest. If you were interested in the truth of what's going on, then you would be at least a little bit curious about it. But of course, if you've already decided what's going on, then of course you don't feel the need. And that's a problem. And in the UK, we saw an identical dynamic this week, albeit thankfully not tied to something as awful as a murder trial. A major report on race in the UK was released. It was heralded as being strongly evidence-based and seeking to reflect upon whether or not the UK is institutionally racist. But in the same way, some people already know the answer to that question, and so would rather be untroubled by your facts and your arguments and your debate. Numerous commentators, particularly on the left, slammed the report as racist even before they'd had a chance to see it. Halima Begum, chief executive of the Runnymede Trust and a Labour Party activist, said this: "Institutionally, we are still racist, and for a government-appointed commission to look into institutional racism to deny its existence is deeply, deeply worrying." When she was pushed on the claim that the UK is not institutionally racist, she said, "Tell that to the 60% of NHS doctors and nurses who died from COVID and were black and ethnic minority workers. You can't tell them because they're dead." On the face of it, that seems a bizarre example to give, since there is no evidence that the higher mortality of COVID-19 to black and ethnic minority people, including health workers, is somehow because of racism. I mean, it's a virus. So it's not surprising that when the report was fully released, the attacks intensified. The Guardian ran a front page with the mother of murdered teenager Stephen Lawrence saying that the report was giving the green light to racists. Clive Lewis, a member of Parliament, tweeted a picture of the KKK in response. Cambridge professor Priyamvada Gopal drew parallels between the Commission's chairman, Dr. Tony Sewell, and Joseph Goebbels. The report attracted hostility because of its message that the term structural racism was too liberally used, and that factors such as socioeconomic background, culture and religion had a more significant impact on the life chances of young people. Calvin Robinson, who was supportive of the report, described it like this: "Unfortunately for some, taking a more evidence-based approach to addressing racial disparities does mean setting aside unhelpful rhetoric. For example, the Commission found no evidence of institutional racism in the UK. That's not to say racism doesn't exist and isn't an area that needs improving, but that racism tends to occur at an individual level rather than institutional. There will always be bigoted individuals offering a warped perspective, but we have made incredible progress in the UK and provide an equal opportunities environment to people of all races. That's something to be celebrated." He went on to say that this conclusion seems to have upset a small number of very vocal politicians and activists who would rather we all go along with their anecdotal, lived experiences than the evidence backed up by data. It's fair to say, though, that some of the critics disputed that take and suggested that the data was cherry-picked by the report and actually did favour their position. Now, in a minute, we'll cover some of the rest of the week's news. But first, we've covered some of the fallout from the report from the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. But what about the detail of the report itself? Is it really a robust and evidence-based look at race that challenges some of the fashionable BLM narrative of last year? Or is it a political cover? A report, the conclusion of which was evident before it was even written, indeed cherry-picking that data and ignoring the rest? Well, I don't know about you, but having read numerous renditions of both versions, I'm kind of keen to know the truth. So I'll be deep diving into that and reporting the outcome in the video to be launched on this channel at 7 PM on Monday next week, 5th of April. Completely open mind. Is Britain racist? With the George Floyd case going on in the US, this is all going to be current for the next few weeks, so we might as well get ahead of it all with some real fact-focused exploration. Join me for that. The World Health Organization had a busy week this week, releasing its report into the origins of COVID-19 and then immediately contradicting the researchers who produced that report, and then latterly criticising Europe for its unacceptably slow vaccine rollout. With the first one, I reported on the press conference that immediately followed the WHO team's investigation in Wuhan, where they bizarrely ruled out the lab leak hypothesis, saying that it was extremely unlikely. Well, unsurprisingly, they've now produced their final report, which notes that they've drawn blanks on all their lines of inquiry, but they still rule out the lab leak hypothesis as being extremely unlikely. Well, the Biden administration is not buying it. The State Department issued a fact sheet in January pointing to the suggestion that lab workers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology got sick in autumn 2019 and that the lab had been carrying out gain-of-function research with bat viruses resembling SARS-CoV-2. The UK government's not buying it, along with 12 other countries that joined the United States, signing a joint statement that, while not explicitly mentioning the lab leak hypothesis, nevertheless made this pointed statement. It is critical for independent experts to have full access to all pertinent human, animal and environmental data, research and personnel involved in the early stages of the outbreak, relevant to determining how this pandemic emerged. And the head of the World Organization itself, Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus, clearly thinks that this doesn't pass the smell test. Although the team has concluded that a laboratory leak is the least likely hypothesis, this requires further investigation, potentially with additional missions involving specialist experts, which I am ready to deploy. It seems as though in the act of declaring that the hypothesis is definitely not a runner, the group has only served to draw the attention of the world more keenly to the very thing that they're trying to put out of the spotlight. And it's not obvious to anyone why it wouldn't be your starting place. The former director of the CDC, Dr. Robert Redfield, agrees and told CNN that he believed the lab leak hypothesis was the most likely explanation. But China's determined to avoid blame for this thing, and understandably so, and it comes down to whether you're prepared to stand up to them or not. If you've not seen it already, I did a video looking in more detail at the evidence and debate around the lab leak hypothesis. Meanwhile, we're still trying to deal with the impact of the virus, and the World Health Organization drew up a report card for Europe and gave it a failing grade. The bloc had an unacceptably slow vaccine rollout, which was worrying in the light of the surge in coronavirus infections that it's seen this week. 5 weeks ago, the weekly number of new cases in Europe had dipped to under 1 million. Last week saw that rising sharply again with 1.6 million cases. All of which just reminds the EU of its abiding interest in possibly preventing the delivery of AstraZeneca vaccine to other countries, by which we mean the UK, and that it might otherwise be able to seize for its own use. The focus of attention is the Helix factory in the Netherlands, the output of which Brussels is insisting must stay in Europe and not be sent to the UK. Well, it turns out this week that British taxpayers funded that factory to the tune of £21 million, which had been intended to enable the factory to scale up the doses it was able to produce and to secure some of them for the UK. Reportedly, the Dutch government was invited to similarly invest, but failed to do so. The Daily Telegraph reported that an EU official had admitted that not a single euro had been contributed by the bloc to the plant. Nevertheless, the EU has said there would be no negotiation with the UK. The Helix plant's output would be diverted to serve the EU. One UK Member of Parliament put it like this: "We invested in this plant. We have contractual entitlements to vaccines. If the EU disagrees with those entitlements, they have the option of going to court. Even in my worst Eurosceptic moments, I would never have dreamt the EU would behave like this." Some on the EU side have been similarly uneasy. The lead EU Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, in his farewell speech, called upon the EU to end the vaccine war with Britain. Speaking this week to the Churchill Europe Symposium, he warned there is no place in such a serious situation for polemics and competition. There are so many more reasons to cooperate in the short term and in the long term. Vaccine manufacturer Pfizer criticised the EU, saying that its requirement that any exporting of vaccine material had to request and wait for permission from the EU bureaucracy, that this was hampering its COVID vaccine production. The US company, which supplies more than 70 countries, including Britain, with vaccine, said that the new EU rules about the free movement of goods across borders were damaging its operations to the detriment of everybody, including the EU. And that rather matters because the Pfizer vaccine is getting fantastic results in its performance against the many powerful variants that a lot of people have been worrying about. The Wuhan, the Kent and the Brazilian types of coronavirus are all protected against. 98% of people aged 80 or over had a strong antibody immune response. In the UK, we now have a reduced vaccine supply due to India's diverting vaccine along with the likely EU property grab. That has meant that priority is now being given to second jabs for those that have already had their first. And everyone over 50 has been offered a first jab. So that is the vast majority of those likely to end up in an ICU, at least assuming that the virus doesn't mutate to become more powerful with the younger age group, which you can't take for granted. In a genius of timing, a number of charities decided this was the moment to call on Boris Johnson to share vaccines with the poorer world instead of, quote, hoarding supplies. Well, of course, nobody here is hoarding supplies. Right now, we don't have enough of them. So that makes perfect sense. They could take the message elsewhere because a number of countries have put a block on vaccinating with the AstraZeneca vaccine again, including some regions in Germany, Norway still, and Canada. And all of this comes down to the statistically illiterate fear that blood clots may be caused by the AstraZeneca vaccine. In spite of all the medical bodies and the World Health Organization saying, no, it's safe. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why the EU has been unacceptably slow, in the WHO's words. The UK, meanwhile, is now starting to argue vigorously about the idea of vaccine passports, a topic that I covered in detail some weeks ago. But in other news, Facebook took down an interview with former President Trump, carried out and posted by his daughter Lara. This was the first time the company had made clear that rather than simply banning Donald Trump's own promotional pages, it was banning any video of him speaking to anybody. She had been sent an email message saying this: in line with the block we placed on Donald Trump's Facebook and Instagram accounts, further content posted in the voice of Donald Trump will be removed and result in additional limitations on the accounts. Whether you have any interest in hearing the words of Trump or not, the idea that Mark Zuckerberg could just decide that the public square that is Facebook will simply not permit it to happen is a chilling Orwellian moment, frankly. Meanwhile, Joe Biden has been launching a $2 trillion infrastructure bill in a bid to stand alongside Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in history. Belying the Sleepy Joe label, Biden instead seems to be rather more of an old man in a hurry, keen to learn from the mistakes of the Obama era that failed to take full advantage of the initial 2-year window when it had control of the legislature. Now, in a moment, we'll get on to responding to comments and the final thought for the week. But first, according to a number of campaigners and journalists and also some of the scientists, we're already into a 6th mass extinction, an inevitable process of wiping out a big chunk of life on Earth, possibly taking us with it. It has become repeated enough to become part of the orthodoxy. But is it actually true? There are all sorts of pressures the human race has put on species, principally through the destruction of habitats and the impact of the use of certain chemicals. At what point have we pushed the system too far and put it in danger of collapse? Are people right when they suggest that we might have already crossed that line? Well, that seems a fairly important topic. So we'll have a look at that in the video going live next Wednesday at 7 p.m. UK time. Join me then. Last Friday, I predicted that Trump would not make a success of creating a new social media platform. I got a number of people who pushed back on that, and I think it's instructive to look at some of this. Here's one that was framed in a provocative tone. Trump had 90 million followers on Twitter, and you think he might get a few followers on his platform? #facepalm. Of course, I never used the phrase "a few followers." My exact words were, "You'll get a bunch of Trump fans signing up, no doubt, and an early fanfare celebrating its rapid growth on launch." If you're interested in non-ideological and nuanced thinking, you have to actively refuse the invitations of commentators like this by projecting onto you a slightly more extreme statement than you actually made and then inviting you to embrace that version and become defensive on its behalf. Once you do, you stop evaluating new information with an open mind and start looking instead for new information that confirms your now position that is under attack. Now, other Trump supporters had more thoughtful and engaging challenges based on an actual argument. So, for instance, this one. Why did you leave off Trump's success in media? Top rating show on a dying network that presaged its turnaround. That wasn't real estate or hospitality. That was the same skill set that made him president on the longest odds of the history of becoming president. And then there was more, but finishing with this. Trump was a real estate developer that single-handedly smashed the Republican Party hierarchy with populism despite having virtually no experience. One of his tools for executing this was Twitter. Why are you so sure that he can't use his instinctual acumen and proven disruptor tactics to decimate his opponents in social media? Mainly for the reasons that I already explained in the video. Creating a social media platform is hard, and companies that had advantages that Trump doesn't have, like Google, have tried and failed numerous times to do it. Trump was no doubt great on The Apprentice, but it wasn't his business. That was him being a performer within someone else's business model. Trump was very impactful with his Twitter account, but that doesn't make you a successful social media entrepreneur. Trump had 90 million followers on Twitter. Twitter currently has around 230 million active users. We don't know how many of Trump's followers were active because there's a steady drop off over time. And we don't know how many were fans, rather than people just wanting to know what the President of the United States was talking about. I would guess that significantly less than half that number would follow him to a new social media platform. Now, it would still overnight be a lot bigger than, for instance, Parler, which has around 2.8 million users. So you would think that success must be built in. But how many of the people signing up would do so in order to be active participants? And how many would simply sign up to passively consume Trump's content? Could it limp along as a niche platform, gaining just enough support to survive? Something that's main function is to be the voice of Trump to a largely passive audience. Well, maybe it could, but that wasn't the proud boast that I was responding to in that video. I rarely make predictions, but here's one for you anyway. I think it's no more than 50% likelihood it ever even launches. I think it's no more than 5% likelihood that it does so, and a year after launch, it's thriving and significantly growing. Napoleon III, so not the really famous one, said this: "If you march at the head of the ideas of your century, these ideas will follow and sustain you. If you march behind them, they will drag you with them. If you march against them, they will overthrow you." I sometimes wonder which I'm doing. You probably should too. I mean, it was surely easy enough when humanity seemed to be on an upwards journey towards enlightenment and prosperity. Even though several of the US founding fathers held slaves, their journals and their diaries showed that they knew that this was against the grain of where history was going. But then to the diehards in the South at the time, they presumably did not recognise the directional sweep of history. Well, what about us today? When you look at the current trends, it's really not so obvious that the current fashions are the next step in the linear progression of humanity towards more prosperity and more enlightenment. I try to remain open to new evidence. I try to remain open to the possibility that any position I currently hold could be wrong and should be changed when that becomes evident. But it feels very much as though we're not on that journey anymore. We're being tempted back into a new dark age. We got on the Martin Luther King train that said people should be judged not by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. But then, as Douglas Murray tends to say, the train reached the station and just kept on going. This week I was on a call with 3 friends who are looking to start a podcast together, and they were agonising because all of them are white. And it had been pointed out to them that maybe 3 white men doing a podcast together was insufficiently diverse. As though being friends and having something to say is no longer enough to associate together. Is that progress? This week there were criticisms that the words of a young black poet who read out her work at President Biden's inauguration might be translated into other languages by white people. One critic suggested such a choice was incomprehensible. Is that progress? Did Martin Luther King get it wrong and really it was supposed to all be about race after all? Now, is that me being the southern slave owner ignoring the sweep of history, or have we gotten to a point where we need to recognise that history moves in waves and not in straight lines? We did, after all, go from the sophistication of the Roman Empire back into the Dark Ages. We have now discovered the scientific process, but we can nevertheless believe in patently false things and enforce those things with the same fury that was once meted out to people who thought that the earth revolved around the sun. Well, it's not hard to conclude that we're contemplating a leap backwards, not the next inevitable step forward. In that case, however awkward it may be, I think you have to make a stand. I branded this channel to do with change makers, and that may have to change because there's just as much to be done in terms of being change resistors. Right now, some of the outcome of that might be that the channel is still getting throttled by YouTube. As I mentioned before, numerous high-performing videos all suddenly plummeted in unison, whether because of a change in the YouTube algorithm or because a video, maybe the review of when Harry became Sally for instance, meant that the channel was added to a blacklist, a shadow banning list. I don't know. But in the spirit of what I've just been talking about, I won't be changing the intent of this channel just to suit the algorithm. And that's something, of course, that is made easier by the fact that there are good people who support me on Patreon. Not only do they enable me to talk about what's important, not just what's uncontroversial, but they also enable me to put in the time to make 3 videos per week, including some which involve quite a lot of research. If you would like to add your support to the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.